Okay, so let's pick this back up. So last time we talked about the U.S. officially entering the war with a declaration on April the 6th of a war against the nation of Germany. And America declares war on April the 6th of 1917. Realistically, while it's not nearly the delay that the Germans had calculated, the U.S. is really not going to do much for the first pretty close to 8 months that it's technically at war. But that doesn't mean there's not changes that come to the United States. Americans at home, in order to meet the perceived needs of the U.S. military, the U.S. officially begins rationing nationwide. Okay, needed war materials, rubber, steel, oil, wood, all these things became virtually unavailable for average Americans. Additionally, the need for supplies like food and basic hygiene materials for the soldiers meant that there was a shortage of these items as well, or a concern at least for a shortage. In order to make up for the lack of availability, the United States began introducing synthetic, chemically produced foods and products, like, say, soap. Um, Up until 1917, all the soap that you bought in America was animal and plant based. It was natural, it was what we would now call organic. Beginning in 1917, the U.S. approved the introduction of artificial and synthetic produced materials to make soap without really understanding or even looking at the long term consequence of this. So, as a result, especially American men have been using hygiene products that are essentially like laundry detergent or dish soap to clean ourselves. And it has had a very profound genetic impact on the long term for future generations of Americans. And it's really not a good one. But the necessity or the perceived necessity of the items for the war meant that you had to do something to sort of compromise. Another great example is the introduction of stuff like margarine, which is essentially, oil based fake butter, in order to make sure that the soldiers were going to have enough that they needed. The U.S. officially adopts meatless and wheatless days. Now, if you were already Catholic or Orthodox Christian, you had no problem with understanding the meatless concept because every Friday for you was already meatless. Well, now it got expanded to meatless Tuesdays, where you also didn't have meat on Tuesdays to support the war effort. And you had, I think it was Wheatless Wednesday, where no pastas, no grains, any type of a wheat based product was encouraged to not be eaten. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't eat them on those days, but in order to make sure that everybody sort of played their part and did their thing, the U.S. introduced ration booklets. You literally could not buy certain products without a permission slip from the government. And if you tried to, you weren't allowed to get them. And if somebody sold them to you illegally and they got caught, there's big problems. There's also the issue of America's entertainment industry shifting to basically a wartime propaganda movement full time for Americans. All the music, all of the plays, all of the theater, all of the movies that people saw were all geared towards expressions of patriotism. 1918 is also the only year that the World Series was actually moved up a full month to accommodate the government order that all eligible men who were not at war had to be working in some war related industry if possible. So, baseball obviously was not seen as one of those, so they got them doing that. So, with the war breaking out in Europe in 1914, there's a sudden, like, immigrant dry up. There's no more immigrants available to do jobs. And in order to meet the demands for the war and to fill normal everyday jobs, anyways, businesses looked to the American South, where they asked large numbers of African Americans to move north and to take jobs that normally would not have been open or available for them, which greatly benefited the African American community. It also expanded the size of places like New York, Chicago, and Detroit that developed huge African American neighborhoods and populations. There's also a shift too when the war actually kicks in fighting wise, that black American men went off to war just like whites and other people did. So, as a result, this need for workers with the war going on still meant that women actively got in the workforce for the first time. Also, a general intolerance for anybody of German American descent. The German language was outlawed in schools, German music was forbidden, German cultural expressions were forbidden. Um, German food was no longer available, all because it was really an effort to demonize Germany and to really sell the idea that this was something that we had to do to make the world safe for democracy. Um, Economically speaking, the demand for products led to exceptionally high wages, which, if you remember our basics of economics, more money available and in circulation means that prices go up too, and inflation shot up. And throughout all of this, there is a growing unease between businesses and labor because businesses, labor was in a position that businesses desperately needed them. And as a result, labor could basically dictate its terms and conditions. Given the fact that everybody was trying their best to be patriotic and on board for the war effort, labor unions conceded a huge, I hate using the word here because it's repeating itself, concession. They gave a huge concession, conceded a huge bargaining chip. And they basically said that for the duration of the war, as long as the war is going on, we will not strike. We will not demand better wages, pay, or conditions. We will not demand a decrease in working hours because factories were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to meet the war demands. In exchange for us doing that, businesses, when the war is over, you're going to make it up to all the workers with better pay, better conditions, more reasonable hours. And this worked, and everybody got along. So the first year of America's actual involvement in the war, 1917. From April to December, the U.S. averages roughly about 2,000 men a month into Europe. That's not a whole heck of a lot. By the end of 1917, there's only 14,000 American soldiers. And basically, all American soldiers do is they fill in the gaps in European lines where people died. Somebody died, you Americans go stand over there and you fight now. The real contribution of America in 1917 was the logistical aspect of building infrastructure. 82 new ports for ships. That's 82 new docks to allow ships to come in. Over 1,000 miles of railroad track were laid in France, and over 100,000 miles of telephone and telegraph wires were set up to accommodate the needs of the front and the war. So it's not like, though, even though America did not officially enter the war until 1917, Americans had been in the war informally. As early as 1915, American citizens went to Canada to join the Canadian Armed Forces and to fight in Europe. Americans joined the French Foreign Legion, which would take anybody, no matter who you were or where you were from or whatever else, and send you over to fight. And there is something called the Lafayette Escadrille, a volunteer air force made up primarily of stunt pilots that went over to Europe to fight on behalf of England and France. In order to meet the needs of the Americans for the war, we institute a draft, the Selective Service Act, where it increased the size of the American Armed Forces from 200,000 to 4 million. Now, these men needed to be trained, they needed to be equipped, they needed to be sent over to Europe. The equipment was the big problem. And early on, America did not even have a usable light machine gun for fighting on the battlefield. I'm going to post a video for you, one or two videos, that talks about the Shoshan, the French machine gun that the U.S. got that was one of the worst made weapons in human history. The American armed forces began arriving in large numbers in France in 1918. Under the command of General John Pershing, aka Blackjack Pershing. Yes, that's the same General Pershing who could not capture Pancho Villa. He couldn't catch a random Mexican guy in his group of banditos, and now he is put in charge of the largest fighting force in American history. Okay. So there is an immediate problem with the American arrival in Europe, which is the Americans refused to be used by the Allies. They never entered an alliance agreement. They are fighting the Germans, and they refuse to fight under Allied command. They will cooperate with the French and the British, but they will not take orders from French and British commanders, only from American commanders. They will not, Pershing will not divide his men up to fight under foreign command. They will all fight under American command or they will leave. The exception to this is the black units. Now, this is where Pershing earned his nickname of Blackjack. He is one of the first early Army officers to allow blacks to play a major combat role for him. And the name Blackjack does not refer to his love of cards, it refers to the fact that he was very reasonable and very open to the contributions that his black soldiers could make. The black Americans are the only ones, by the way, who are actively allowed to fight with the Allies and under Allied command. So they're the ones who are sent occasionally to help the British and the French out when they desperately need it. As the Germans gear up for the last major offensive of the war, they specifically go after the Americans, believing that the American forces are going to be unprepared and not well trained enough to withstand an attack. And the Germans specifically target the areas where the Americans are stationed with the idea of breaking America to break the stalemate. Okay, we're going to pick it up at the next episode here. Peace and love. I will post these two videos here. Okay. The second video is about the American Browning automatic rifle, which changes how the Americans are actually able to fight the war. And we'll go into more detail about that in the next lesson. Toodles.